Well, bonjour, good afternoon, and welcome. Thank you for coming to join us at Daphne, and hi to everyone who's online. I'm Victoria Dickenson with the Hidden Hands Project. Merci d'être parmi nous cet après-midi chez Daphne.
What role does the natural world play in your work, and how does your work interact with the natural world?
So basically for me, I guess, nature sort of appears as a way in which I can see the comparison, how it has been represented, how it has been cataloged, and then also the slippages within the catalog when we actually get involved with nature, then the kind of experiences that we have and how much of that actually can be contained within the archive and how much of that cannot be contained. So the ephemeral aspect of it, I guess, that is something that is a big takeaway for me when I think about my relationship with nature.
Hidden Hands is a project that I'm able to engage with because these archives are digitized. So I'm looking at these natural archives through the prism of my screen. But then there's this human component where this morning she showed me making natural dyes, how these processes happen. And I think more of this needs to happen so that the natural world and the digital one, those relationships are mediated by our own agency and in how we decide what that looks like and what knowledge production the interstices of those spaces are. What were your reactions when viewing historical collections related to the natural world?
Well, the first time I went to the archive at Concord was with Michelle, and that was in the fall. And I didn't really know what to expect. I've never been to the archive before, but it was a really moving experience because it was a group of Métis women from our community that went, and Michelle brought medicine, so we did a dry smudge for ourselves and for the pieces, and there was a spirit plate to feast the beadwork, and we just visited for the whole afternoon, and it was quite touching and more like emotional than I thought it would be, because it was sort of just sad to think of these beautiful pieces just locked away for so long. And we weren't allowed to, touch them. And that was really hard as a beadwork artist. I just wanted to pick them all up, and we couldn't put our faces too close because they had toxic chemicals on them that we could ingest. So it was just a bit of a harsh reality, meeting those regulations. But it was very nice and to see the objects. They're absolutely beautiful. And I was lucky enough to go back with Mallory earlier this week, and I brought my beads, and I wasn't allowed to bead at the same table as the objects, but we pulled up a little trolley beside it. So I sat near them and did some beading, and that was really nice. But yeah, it was a moving experience, and now I feel connected in some ways to those pieces, and I hope that I'll be able to continue to visit.
So when you went and beaded the other day, though, were you sort of you were beading with the ancestors? Was that your intention?
Yeah, I thought that it would be nice to bring those materials together so that my beads could hang out with those beads. And I think that the vocabulary is so important because for us, for me at least, it really felt like visiting with these ancestors that or relatives that really have a presence and a life force, and you can feel the energy and the spirit. So they're definitely not just objects.
I've had the chance to visit the McGill's rare books to look at the rabbit's drawings. It was very interesting to not treat it as history, but as knowledge of now. And also revealing the social trauma around the telling of history.
And I love that little phrase, I wrote it down, knowledge of now, that because it's going both, it's going in all directions and we're always.
Yeah, because there's a lot of birds that I've seen, the rabbit that I've seen in my backyard, that's funny to the rabbits that I got to know their names. Like I would never have, because a lot of it hasn't been recorded in contemporary Haiti, so it's not taught at schools, it's not taught in, like, we know more about the fauna, the flora of here in Haiti than the flora of Haiti in Haiti, because most of the educational system was built around Christianism and the help of the Canadian Catholic Church and so on. So a lot of the curriculum doesn't involve knowledge of the place. And the rabbi had more knowledge of the place than a lot of the books that I had access to studying in school. Having that example, that sample of examples, really triggered what natural history can tell us about history. Really triggered that in me, and how it can remove some of the demarcations you were talking about, how natural history removes them because the nature keeps on living, the system doesn't change, doesn't die. The natural systems are the same, just a matter of preserving them and finding those information again. I work with textiles, so a lot of those historical textiles, working with them have always been eye-opening, but also at the same time, at times it really makes me sad that, we talk about a lot of these materials, that these are the kind of materials which might have been used, but then the hands which went behind making those materials actually alive, we don't know about that. And that knowledge has been like such a important part of like understanding these materials, but not having access to those can definitely make us think about nature in a very different way. And it kind of like that missing link that we have the material, we have like some of the archival resources written about them, but still we cannot really put them together. There is something that is still missing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like listening to what everyone has to say. It's really interesting. I guess I've had like kind of mixed reactions. Like I've been really like moved and really like inspired by seeing a lot of Indigenous women's beadwork in collections, but also it's like really upsetting as well. Because like there's so many questions that around like collection histories and around thinking about just like the nature of how Indigenous art was collected, and thinking about the McCord collection. I think there was so many questions that we had at our visit in October, like what were these women's lives like? How were these collected? Why were they collected? How do we honor these women and their knowledge and then also like, yeah, just like the privilege, I guess, of like seeing that work now as like a historical memory, but then it's, yeah, like its power in the present and like inspiring future generations. But yeah, for me, it's been like a mixed reactions, I guess. And then I'm interested in kind of like also how do I write about that, like as an art historian, and be sensitive to like the different sort of ethical questions, consensual questions, also the lack of ethics too, I think is a big question mark. And also too, like just bringing up this question around like touching and like conservation, it's really upsetting to think like, who has the right to touch and who should be touching and like why hasn't that changed and shifted?
Can I ask Victoria to just like tell us a little bit more about the Hidden Hands project and what started it all off? And because the next series of questions are very philosophical and also very hopeful in a really good way. But I've just been thinking for the last few minutes, it would be really lovely to just sort of have a slightly different take on where this all came from and how you do it.
It started with an image. So we worked on a project called the Gwilym Project about two English sisters who arrived in India and lived there in Madras, now Chennai, between 1801 and 1807. One of these sisters, Elizabeth Gwilym, was an extremely gifted painter of birds. Then we found drawings by her sister in another collection. We found her letters home to her mother and her sister. And we discovered these two sisters. And one of these drawings, done by Mary Simons, was of the bird catchers. And so we realized that Elizabeth's extraordinary paintings of birds were impossible without the work of the bird catchers. Elizabeth's work, these paintings, which are these material remains, had these extraordinary stories behind them of the people who found the birds, captured the birds. Elizabeth's cook skinned the birds for her. Apparently there used to be bird skins all over the house. But all these people made possible this work of natural history, this global enterprise of of natural history, which took place in it's imperial, these imperial natural histories. And so this kind of inspired us to think about, well, could we look at other collections in these McGill collections, which are fabulous, and could we see what were the hidden hands? Who were the people who were actually responsible behind it's almost like you're behind a kind of veneer wall, and then you look behind it, and there's all this sort of army of people behind who make these sort of slender objects, which are what remains. So how can we look at what remains and then look behind it? And so that was the inspiration for this project, and it's led us into the most extraordinary places. So I think this whole challenge that you're addressing is a fascinating one. I've been sort of typing down all these little things, getting into the knowledge of now through this kind of going through the window of the archive, if you will, and trying to understand what's behind it. And then how do we make sure that the knowledge that is captured in these kinds of investigations and this has been my concern all along, how do you make so that we don't have to do it again? So that we can capture and make sure it's in the archive, that, you can come 20 years from now and find Clovis's observations that are there. And then you can think about what they said at that time, right? So this layering of knowledge and information. So I think that's, God, I've gone on forever, but that's what Hidden Hands is about. It's a very exciting project. We were funded by Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, you have to say that. And we're very grateful to them. We're very grateful to them. But it's also made possible, and I want to thank Anna for her inspiration on doing this workshop, to bring the artists together, to bring this materiality, this material practice into the discussion of the archives. And I want to thank the artists and the curators who are here and who are thinking about how we bring the materiality into the archives. Because I get still very excited by archival documents. But I think it really is important, this experiential piece, which brings new knowledge into the question of history, and I think can help us rewrite and rethink history to a large extent. So yeah, I'm very happy. So that's it again. Sorry about that. That was very long.
That was absolutely perfect. Thank you. That was a good interlude. Can material culture help reinvigorate memories and restore lost memories and reimagine the past?
Thinking about memory and beadwork and material culture of beadwork. Normally, I'm not like a super fast learner. Like it takes me a bit of time, but when I started beading, it just clicked and it felt so natural. And it makes me think about like learning something versus remembering something. It like woke something up inside of me where I was like, I need to reclaim this because I know that this is meant for me.
When we are studying certain kind of objects from the historic collections, colonial archives, or whatever it is, we need to perhaps always be cognizant of that fact that these objects have always been part of people's experiences, not always pleasant experiences, but yes, I mean, that is the lived reality. So for now, if we consider them as something that is removed from the reality, removed from the realm of experiences, then we end up like considering them as objects at a distance, at a critical distance, the way the art historians would call it. When we also sort of engage in certain kind of this experiential aspects of material culture, we sort of understand that it is not just a mere technique, but it is also part of a knowledge system, perhaps, which can only be activated through this practice.
I was going to say, I think that everyday, like the notion of the everyday is a really powerful prism for engaging in knowledge work. And we know from folks who work in art spaces and in the academy, the ways in which the everyday can be or has historically been invisibilized, feminized. The labor itself is devalued or invisible. And there's this notion of originality and authorship that gets associated with like artistic or intellectual genius. But this conversation about the everyday as this site of like real imagination, and not just that, but connection between people is a really powerful one, and one I think that it's easy to lose sight of. And that's why studying belongings, material culture brings us back to that in a really real way. And also what we can't know about the everyday, right, from the archives, what the archives don't tell us. Yeah, exactly. Those silences within the archives, specifically colonial archives, of which there are gaping silences. What do we make of that? What do we do with that?
Taking it to the next question, which is about the display of those ancestors, those ancestral items, was how we move away from a colonial mindset when we bring them, and how we can do that when we bring things out and put them on display.
Finding new ways to tell the stories, like maybe if I'm presenting an object, I don't have to have a written description for that object. Maybe my description is a dance. Maybe my description is a poem. Maybe my description is a movement or something else, something ephemeral. So it's having other ways of thinking about knowledge and what knowledge is, and not confusing knowledge all the time with the accumulation of information. It's like the experience itself is the knowledge, and that's it. It doesn't need to be packaged in any other way. It doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to have codes. It doesn't need to fit certain codes. The experience is the knowledge. So finding new ways to create those knowledge within those institutions, even if that knowledge doesn't fit the agenda of the institution, is what's important. It's like, I don't think you're gonna decolonize institution because it's impossible. However, you can have a totally uncolonized experience within the colonized institution. And it's finding ways to create those uncolonized experiences within those colonial structures. That's more or less how I see it moving forward.
Dr. Petrushka Moyes is an artist and a curator, and she is now responsible for digitally curating all this massive archive of Haitian art that happens to be in Iowa. It doesn't happen to be, that's by design and has a long history. But, and she's using or thinking through Vodou epistemologies for creating these data structures that are going to hold these pieces. So the notion of the laku, the potomitan, she's thinking through what does this look like in a digital architecture to hold these pieces too. And does that create like an accessible visiting digital? Like the whole question of accessibility is also haunted by this colonial paradigm. Who gets to access what and how? And I think that enters not just in the physical spaces of museums, but very much within the metadata that we create for these pieces, right? Her work is, I think, really interesting in this question of decolonial practice, because she's thinking about it in the material space, but also very much in the digital landscape around this archive that she's generating. I think that's like a really interesting and exciting example of a decolonial, for her, local epistemological approach to thinking through how she wants to engage with this collection.
I think there is something like subversive in looking at like beadwork, Indigenous women's beadwork, and like all this hidden hands, like the hidden labor that's gone into so many of these belongings. You know, there is something subversive about just spending that time and focusing and studying and like dedicating your life's work to that. So yeah, I'm interested in that subversive, subversive histories, I guess, and how do we like bring that out contemporary?